Thank you for listening to the Allender Center podcast. I'm Dr. Dan Allender.
And I'm Rachel Clinton Chen. We're fiercely committed to providing hope and healing to a fragmented world.
And restoration for the heart.
Thank you for joining us. Let's get this conversation started.
Rachel, every time we do this, it's really fun. But there's certain days, certain opportunities that I can just say, I went to bed last night just anticipating what this day would hold. I mean, when you get a chance to be in the presence of a luminary, an iconoclast, a complex, brilliant, sweet and difficult, but deeply godly human being, it's a good day. And of course, I'm talking about you, Rachel.
Oh, sure.
But I'm also talking about Ian Cron. And we have the privilege of being with really a remarkable human being. So, Ian, welcome. Rachel, welcome.
Thank you, Dan. Good to be with you.
And the words fit: luminary, iconoclast, complex, brilliant, difficult, beautiful.
Yes, all the above. I'm as you might imagine, a bouquet of contradictions. So
right there, close it down, baby. Like a bouquet of contradictions, which again has a fragrance and a complexity where you just go, let me sniff it, but I'm more likely to snort it. So here we go. Rachel, I think you're going to need to manage two difficult men today. So
oh, no, I'm not going to work
charge.
that hard. I'm actually just going to enjoy the play. So
if you have a direction, great. If not, look, this man has brought something of the Enneagram and the life of Christ and the heartbreak and magic of addiction and the reality of what redemption looks like for those of us who are pretty significantly broken into a realm of what it means to live out something of the beauty of being beloved. So as we introduce you, Ian, I want people to know that this new book, The Story of You, the Enneagram Journey to Becoming Your True Self, is a brilliant follow-up to The Road Back to You. And we're going to talk about the Enneagram. And I know many of our listeners know you and also know the Enneagram. Some ain't never heard of me or frankly, of the Enneagram. I don't want this to be a 101 basic. So I just want to say to folks, the Enneagram is one of the most complex, rich entries into both a description of personhood and personality, but also a framework for understanding others, but also understanding what it means to mature. So if this is a new category to you, The Road Back to You is a great book to begin. But we're going to mostly be talking about your new book, The Story of You. But before we get there, I just wanted to, I mean, you do know you're a sage, correct?
I have an increasing awareness as I, now in my early 60s that I might have something of use to say to people. And I try to temper that with enough humility to realize it might be long-winded. So, I guess if that's a sage, then thank you. Yes.
Well, I think we certainly see you as a sage. And at least I want you to begin by how did that happen? Like, I don't think anyone goes, I think I would like to be a sage when I grow up. But there's a process by which one becomes what even, in some sense, in both your awkwardness and humility, don't quite want to name that you are. So how did that happen?
I've never had anyone ask me that question. I think the first thing that comes to mind, and it will sound perhaps, I think I've tried to suffer well. and I've spent a lot of my life trying to make sense of and help others make sense of their own suffering. That to me is not a melancholic preoccupation with personal darkness or tragedy. It really is about realizing that is such fertile ground for self-understanding, and also entering into conversation with the mystery of God in our own lives. And so I find that hopeful, beautiful work, and I've dedicated my life to that in a strange way. And I think along the way it's given me some wisdom that might be of service to others, as it has been to me.
Hmm. Well, it's a blunt question. What's the nature of the suffering that you've endured that's brought you with some degree of intentionality to truly be a sage?
Well, I grew up in a profoundly troubled home. My father was an alcoholic and a drug addict. He was a diagnosed narcissistic personality disorder, probably bumping on the sociopathic end of that. And so that provided a difficult entry point into the world. Then the development of my own alcohol and drug addiction, treatment, being in treatment for it. It's been a lifelong struggle. That's not one of those things. You snap your fingers and magically it disappears. And these are the kinds of ways that have brought me into a place of self-exploration and self-discovery, in service really though to trying to figure out who God is in the middle of all that. Like dealing with what are these desires? What are these places of emptiness that demand some kind of filling? Um, I don't have the answers to that, but I have some intuitions and some provisional guesses as to what those things might be. So, uh, so that's maybe just a few points, touch points as to what my own personal suffering. Um, and I love what you said here earlier about the heartbreak and magic of addiction. I just think that's
Mm.
fantastic. I mean, I just wrote it down. In fact, I have a pen because I know from my last conversation with you, always bring a pen to a conversation with Dan Allender, because he's going to have turns of phrase that I swear to God are going to show up in my next book, just so you know, without without attribution, I might add.
Oh,
Anyway, um,
without attribution is the only way to honor somebody who bears even some wisdom. So I am beyond honored that I would be non-attributed but present in your life and work. Yeah,
well,
I mean,
anyway,
as a fellow addict, and like I have seen such darkness in my own massive amounts of attempts to fill my life, but I've also seen that there is that reality that the deepest heart's desires often show themselves in a mistaken and heartbreaking way in the midst of addiction. So addiction has been
mm,
obviously just a central part of your life in terms of not only your family of origin, but in terms of your own realm of walking. And I do think a lot of sages end up um, having the tutelage of the addictive process as, again, maybe not a friend that I want to hang out with, but it's a friend that's reintroduced me to God again and again.
mm, yeah, me too, man.
I'm looking at you, Rachel, because I have a million things that I want to ask this man, and I'm just I really will be rude if are there directions that you have?
Yes, let me interrupt this beautiful conversation to take this in a different direction. No, I'm well with us continuing. And I think I want to reiterate that language, Ian, that you shared around wisdom being so deeply connected to like suffering and being cultivated out of suffering. Um, and that just resonates with my own life and experience, and really resonates with the people I trust so deeply, um, to speak speak with wisdom and to turn to for some sense of how to make sense of God, how to make sense of our humanity, how to make sense of the world, even though our own inclination is to want to escape suffering. And so I appreciate that, the languaging of that connection.
So, if I can just jump back in, like in fourth or fifth grade, did you have a kind of peculiar self-awareness of yourself in the world?
Well said. Um, yes, absolutely. I was kind of a quirky kid. I had I grew up in a very Roman Catholic environment, and went to Catholic school. I was deeply immersed in Catholic culture, ritual, mythology. I had a Mother Mary nightlight. We had our house was full of statues, and our clothes smelled like incense. After being in Sunday mornings, and I was very swept up in the mass. I did not enjoy Catholic education, but I loved the mass, and there was something about the inarticulable, the unnameable that I experienced in the mass that deeply drew me. And I was a kid that liked poetry. I was a kid who liked I loved even songwriting. I loved uh, uh, which, when you're growing up around a bunch of other Irish Catholic kids who loved brawling and baseball, it didn't exactly make me a social fit. And so I did. I think I always had this sense that the world was brimming with God, and I just was always very attuned to it in a way that I'm sure made other kids scratch their heads. And so, yes, I definitely was a kid that in fifth grade was not exactly like all the other fifth graders, though. I was part of that fraternity of young people that seem to have been taken, arrested, I think, by God's presence in all things.
Mm. Well, the reason I ask, and we'll come back to this in a moment, is one of the things that have it's troubled me with regard to the Enneagram, at least in past interactions, reading, etc., is so much of my thinking in life has been built in and through the process of story. And though there's no contradiction in looking at the Enneagram and thinking about narrative, I just haven't seen a lot of work done that allows us to come through the lens of the Enneagram into the nature of story. So when I had the privilege of being on your podcast and you were putting words to this new book, I'm telling you, that was just a sense of I cannot wait to get my hands on this book to see what you do and how you engage story. And I think that's one of the geniuses of this book. At one point, you write that that some people use the Enneagram as a tool to reinforce their old story, and that I'd love just to kind of begin with that and to say, obviously, you have seen some concern or you wouldn't have written this book, engaging both story and Enneagram. So, how is it that people engage the Enneagram, at least historically, in some situations and not step into story?
Right. Well, I think, I can remember when I first learned about the Enneagram and they referred to these nine personality types, there was always a piece of me that felt like, personality type. Okay, I'll run with that. But there was just something in me that was a little bit like, there's something more here. And for years, I could not figure it out exactly what it was, but it was this intuition. This is because, personality is such a hotly contested debate. And we've studied things like personality theory, personality development. Nobody agrees on where
Right.
that comes from. In fact, they all argue with each other. And so I remember I just began studying the work of Dan McAdams and narrative therapy, and I remember, some of which I like, some of which I don't, in their application. But I was taken up by, found a lot of positive material in it, and I remember then having this insight that, oh my gosh, wait a minute. These aren't personality types exclusively anyway. These are 9 archetypal stories that we see so often in the general population that we should just pay attention to them. That's all, you know. And I think when we understand them as stories, then we are then prevented from merely looking at these as static personality types, in which people go, well, that's just what I am, and which can only give them license to continue in the predictable, habitual, negative patterns of behavior that don't serve them or others. And I just love to talk about them in the language of narrative, of story, because stories are fluid, stories evolve, stories can change, stories can be rewritten or reinterpreted. And then because and also story, when it's presented this way, gives people a language of transformation that otherwise you might not have. And so I just love this way of approaching the topic of the Enneagram. I think it makes it more useful to people on a transformational journey.
Yeah, I think it's really powerful, the ways in which, and I know other people using the Enneagram do this too, but I love the ways in which in your book and also on your podcast and working with people that you highlight that it's meant to be a like story transformation, and it's not that we're bound. It's not
Hmm.
like we're coming to this to kind of type ourselves and we're just bound to these realities of us, that there is fluidity, there is transformation. And I love your language of like noticing and owning like the strengths and the shadow. And we talk a lot at the Allender Center
Hmm.
about like we are both beautiful and broken. And those things
Yes.
will always be true to some extent, but we can grow and transform where we're not as bound to our brokenness, where it doesn't have to be the primary story, even if it will always in some ways be a part of the story. And I know for myself, I came to the Enneagram after being immersed in like Allender Center story work. And actually, I laugh because engaging your book and reading through the different types, it was so helpful because I actually think it was confusing for me coming directly through the lens of story, because we have, we're really dynamic. So I was like, well, I could be this based on these thematic stories, and I could be this. And I found your writing so helpful in locating it in these archetypal stories and seeing which ones are most primary, because yeah, of course with the Enneagram we kind of touch all of them, but what are the ones that keep us bound?
The great category, nature, nurture, something's given, something's not. And in the intersection of those realms, we know there is something of personhood and the uniqueness of that. So as we step into story, you've articulated that you would fit something of the Enneagram 4. I'm curious how you have played and thought about the intersection of your relationship with your father, and just to, and I'm making assumptions here, so you can correct quickly. I would presume, as I asked, that you were very sensitive, deeply aware, poetic presence in the world. And uh, from what you've described in the book and other places, your father, that would not quite fit the way he engaged the world. I would not think that there would have been a lot of warmth toward a boy who loved poetry and was caught in the fragrance of incense. So, given that, I can't imagine that there was a great deal of warmth between you and your father. Is that again a fair set of sentences?
Yes, he was as I mentioned, deeply troubled. He was could be cruel. For my father, there was a certain amount of entertainment in um, seeing the effects of his um, power over
Mhm.
other people. Um, and it's taken me some time to arrive at some healing and some measure of understanding of his brokenness that has given me some hard won peace about the experience. And my whole family. I mean, we're talking about a bunch of Irish Catholic brawlers. I mean, really, my brothers. I mean, I hate to say this, but my family had the emotional intelligence of Shrek. They were just, I mean, they just were not at all attuned to the same things that I was. And that is not to say that I'm better. It's not to say that, there's a buttercup in the manure. I'm just saying that we were so different from each other that even if he'd been a sober human being, we wouldn't have known what to do with each other. And so yeah, and I do think that gave birth to a story, right? Because these broken stories that we inhabit really are born of the spoken words and the silences that we experience growing up. They're born of internalized messages and of you know and they're useful.
Yeah. Yeah.
They're useful as little people. But as Carl Jung, who's a great hero to me, would say, that, and there's a bastardization of it, but that which helps you survive the morning of life will kill you in the afternoon. And so, we have to face these stories in all of their brokenness and beauty. By the way, I love what you said, Rachel, because actually it's not in my office right here, but I have a beautiful 200-year-old kintsugi bowl that a friend named Mako Fujimura gave me as a gift. And it's about 200 years old. And
Wow.
to me, every time I look at it, I go, look, there's the gospel.
Yeah.
Every single time. Broken and beautiful. And in fact, more beautiful than it was prior to its breakage. I mean,
That's
to
right.
me, that just sort of captures the whole of the gospel. And how do we hold these truths in tension and sort of, not disavow either, but to live in this sort of wonderful tension between the two. And that's like learning to ice skate every day, isn't it?
Yeah, amen. Well, back to that question of how has a 4 come to see something of the nature of the narrative of being truly odd man out,
Yes.
and it's, again, not asking you to divulge any more than you wish, but I would imagine that there was cruelty
Yeah.
directed against something of that unique, tender, wise, poetic heart at a very young age. So
Yeah.
in the engagement and being able to name as a 4, as a romantic, as somebody who longs to be, but also is very special. How does that help you name and engage some of the harm you've endured in that world?
Man, that's a great question. And so I grew up, I think, the underlying premise of the story I crafted as a young person to make sense of my life in the world ran something like this. There is something fundamentally broken, some unredeemable deficiency at my core that disqualifies me from love, relationship, and belonging in the world. And there is this missing component in my essential makeup that everyone else seems to have. Everyone else seems to have normalcy and happiness and ease in the world. And I don't for some reason. And so it created, I think, in me this sense that had been relegated to the Isle of Misfit Toys, and that somehow or another I was going to have to compensate to win back a place in the world where I finally belong. Now, here's the crazy thing. My strategy, as it is for most 4s, was to project a image, if you will, of specialness and uniqueness, which would then, I hoped, convince others to welcome me home into the world. Now, of course, as is true with all the 9 stories of the Enneagram, the strategies we employ to get our needs met in the world actually frustrate any possibility
They
of
really
getting those
backfire.
needs met.
They really backfire.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to belong in the world and then you cast yourself as someone who's special and unique, all that ends up happening is other people push you away because you are so far outside the social norm, or they pedestalize you in such a way that you now are some kind of better person than they. It's a and that is true for all 9 stories. I would also say, just as a point of reference, how do I know these are broken stories? Because the underlying premise of every single one of them is in direct opposition to the story of grace. And so, obviously, there's nowhere in the gospel, in our sacred text, that says you are unredeemably deficient. There is something missing in you that everyone else has, that for whatever reason God has withheld from you. And this is what you have to do in order to earn relationship and love. I mean, and I could go through all 9 stories of the Enneagram, and we would all agree these are broken stories. If for no other reason, then they run in direct opposition to what God would have us believe about ourselves and the way the world
Absolutely.
works.
Yeah, it's just delicious.
I'm just thinking about I'm like, I'm just thinking of my own broken story archetype. And I think, yes, the contrariness and yet the ongoing work to
Yes.
receive what is most true of that grace and
And
the
too, Rachel,
impulse
thank
to
you.
push it.
Beautifully said. And I would say that, of course, in your case, as an Enneagram 2, the helper, or even a better word for you would be the befriender. I think that, of course, nowhere in the gospel does it say that in order to win love and esteem, that you have to meet the needs of others while at the same time disavowing your own personal needs, and as a strategy for winning approval, engage in calculated strategic giving.
I know.
Craziness, right?
I know. In my resistance to being it too, I remember just like, oh, I think I'm something else. And then God very graciously, in a time of reflection and just bringing back things like my first therapist saying, you need to fast from helping relationships. There's something you're getting from this that's actually deeply pathological. Or do you believe God loves you more than God loves God's mission for you? So I had to start to reckon with, no, everything you're saying, absolutely true. And, and I think that that's what can be so tragic about these broken stories. Like you named, there's a time in which they help us survive and they help us get our needs met in ways that get us through deprivation and a lot of things. But it does reach a point where it actually starts to really harm and keep us from what we're most meant for. And I appreciate the ways in which you're also inviting us to ponder, what could those new stories be? What are we meant to awaken to? What is this grace of God that actually is meant to break through and bring and help us rewrite a different story?
Mm, mm. You just reminded me, I saw a bumper sticker the other day, and I have it. I'm going to put it on my wall. It said, "This is life. It sucks. You're going to love it."
That is,
Man.
again, what you expect, at least as you begin that, is the simple shit happens.
Right.
But it's like, no, this excrement has the potential to grow something really remarkable if you at least spread it and allow goodness to arise within it. And even to come back into some of what I found so helpful, the category of S.O.A.R. That acronym, S-O-A-R. I just want you to walk us through how you've been able to use that as you've been wrestling, again, with your own story. I mean, you have known humiliation, you have known cruelty, and yet I think your presence is one, again, not going to beatifically hold you into the realm of glorification here, but nonetheless, there is a kindness about you and the ability to invite and to welcome. And most strangers, most people who have been in some sense left out, are not often the most welcoming human beings. So something's happened for you. And again, I know it's impossible to enumerate in a kind of step by step by step, but nonetheless, I think that notion of, look, you got to see, you've got to own, you've got to awaken, and indeed you've got to rewrite. It's just a helpful lens for thinking about the work of restoration.
Yes. Well, first of all, I want to say, by way of that, Dan, first of all, thank you. And it's deeply encouraging. I had an experience when I was 8 years old. And I mentioned this because I think it's an interesting backdrop to answering your question. I remember it was a Saturday morning. It was around 7 a.m. I grew up in Connecticut. And so it was one of those days, autumn mornings, that was, the sky was that perfect azure blue, and the leaves were at their peak, and there was no traffic on the streets. And I jumped on my bike and I was just riding along. And, you know, in the most unexpected way, I had this moment where I felt transported. I would say that it was a truly a mystical kind of a visitating moment, where I felt, and it only lasted about 8 seconds. Honestly, it lasted 8 seconds, where I had this profound, elevated sense of two things, well, three things maybe. One is that I was profoundly connected to all things, that there was an interconnectedness to life, and that I was a constituent part of it. Secondly, that that I actually belonged here in a very powerful, deep way. And then I would say also this sense that everything was going to be all right. I cannot explain it. To this day, I get a little emotional about it, but I really had this sense, it's okay. This is going to be all right, you know? And I mention that because, in part, I think in many ways, my addictions were my disorganized attempt to try and recreate that experience for myself through some kind of a chemical shortcut.
Yeah.
Right. I just was always chasing the dragon. That was the dragon. I was sort of looking for the window of ecstasy that would somehow take me back to those 8 seconds, which I think is, I think in some ways all addicts, which we all are frustrated mystics. That's at some level, as Carl Jung would say. And to your initial question, which I cannot remember because I got so swept up in the storytelling of that, but it was related somehow to it. The journey I set out in the book of S.O.A.R really is, well, it's reductive, but at least it gave some framework to people to do their work, right? So the first step in the journey is to see, and that is really to look back upon your life and to recount the story. It is to take inventory. It is to look back upon the losses. It is to in a way that is with a great deal of self-compassion and even sometimes a disinterest. It's like, I'm simply going to name what happened here. I'm not going to get wrapped up in it. I'm just going to name it, right? Then I think comes that process of owning. I think this is shadow work. I think this is acknowledging our participation in the broken story, unconscious as it may have been. And also it is to reclaim what Jung would call the golden shadow, that in your shadow is not only darkness, but there is unclaimed, disavowed beauty that needs to be brought to the fore and owned. And of course, as you two know, in some ways, it's much more frightening to own your beauty than it is to name your brokenness. I mean, brokenness is easy.
Yeah.
You can just say, well, nothing I can do. It's like, and then people always go, oh, well, I'm broken and it's all about grace. It's like, yeah, but there's also this beauty in you
That's right.
that is going to scare the hell out of you, because
right.
now you're going to have to be accountable to its use in the universe, right?
Oh, we're
So
saying
that's
amen, brother. Amen.
then I think there's this awakening component, and if there's four, if of all the letters, awakening is a little of the funkiest of the four, right? I think that number one, I think that it's a shame that we don't often say this, but I think that Christianity is an Enlightenment religion. Which always scares Christians, because they're like, "Oh, that's so Eastern," and I'm always saying, "Well, it is a Near Eastern religion." That's
That's
aside,
right.
but I always I always want to say that, if Jesus is the light of the world, is not the point to become therefore enlightened, right? To become filled with the light of the world. And so words like awakening and enlightenment, to me, it's sad that we don't include them in the lexicon of our own faith, right? Um, to me, awakening is, how do we begin to develop a mind that has the capacity in the moment to monitor, to observe, to monitor, and self-regulate,
Yeah.
to realize in the moment what is happening right now.
Yeah.
Am I living in that old story again? How do I extricate myself from this old story and reclaim a new story? Um, and I think it's also awakening to, well, what are these old scripts?
Mm-hmm.
It's like, and how do I know when I have fallen? Because these stories, don't they have a trance-like quality?
Mm-hmm.
We just sort of fall into them. It's that fish water trope.
Yep.
It's like, we find ourselves in this sort of trapped in this mechanistic autopilot that,
Mm-hmm.
of the old story. And then R is the rewrite process. And I think this is sort of left up in part to the discretion of the reader. I provide some ideas as to how that can be done. But again, I feel like this requires the pen and the paper as well. What is the story that I want to live? What would I name it, for example? I oftentimes say it's a powerful exercise with people to say, okay, well, please title the memoir of your early life for me.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say, well, for me, it was The Lost Boy, right? The Lost Boy. And if I were to rename the book now, one of the many titles I guess I would have for the new story in which I find myself would be The Redeemed Man.
Mm-hmm.
And so, even just that exercise alone in the rewrite is terrifically powerful. So see, own, awaken, rewrite. It's a lifelong process. You'll always be editing. There's no finished book.
That's right.
So that's how it rolls for us.
Well, as we come, unfortunately, not quite to an end, but I want you to work with Rachel now. And she's a remarkable, wise, I would also say sage. And she has to deal with a good friend, companion, and co something or other, who's an 8. So, or maybe a 4 or an inverted 4 or whatever. So, as you think, and you've had at least some encounter now with the two of us, how do you see a 2 and 8 playing together? And counsel for this good woman as to how she is to live well in the presence of difficulty.
Yes. Well, I would say number one, to recognize that any two people who have consciously and intentionally begun the journey toward self knowledge in service, not to self realization, as much as in service to participating well in the ongoing program of redemption that Jesus is about in the world, right? That's the reason, right? And for to the degree that you are self-aware and doing that work, any two numbers can be fantastic together. If there's a gap, one person is doing the work and the other one is even perhaps being intentionally resistant to the work, the bigger this gap, the greater the distance that
Yeah.
will be between the two of you, right? I would say that, for you, Dan, the underlying premise, I think, as a young person that an eight begins to subscribe to, is that the world is a hostile and dangerous place in which the powerful dominate the weak, and in which you are resolved. It's like it's like Batman. He has that vow early in life, right? I'm going to get all those people who killed my parents. He makes that vow. It's such a beautiful illustration of what children do unconsciously.
Mhm.
Right? They make promises,
That's
they make
right.
oaths about what they will do with their life, and of course, that'll screw you up. Who wants to follow? It's always a problem when you follow the dictates of an 8-year-old, and so you know, it's not something you want to do for the rest of your life, right? And so, I think what the eight does then is they assert strength and power over others in the environment in order to mask from themselves and others vulnerability and weakness. Now, Dan, you've done a ton of work, and so this underlying premise has been, I'm sure, profoundly interrogated and challenged by you, right? So you are perhaps no longer as governed from the shadows by this under this sort of set of assumptions. However, we carry the residue of
The
these things in
residue,
our,
yes.
yeah, in our lives. And I think, what is interesting, one of the things that you can borrow from Rachel is um, this belief in a cruciform life where the heart is open to the world, right? And is willing to be broken and to be vulnerable, to not see vulnerability as weakness, but to recognize that when we are weak, we are strong. This is the great paradox that eights are having to learn. And I know that this is something you've done. I know that also that your strength, which is very apparent, um, can be used to step into other people's lives and to sometimes with, dare I say it, grace can be violent. And so, right? I mean, this is a Flannery O'Connor idea, right? But grace can be
Yes.
violent. And so your capacity to step in and call bullshit on people's assumptions in a way that, I mean, sometimes I think, probably feels like a left hook out of nowhere. See, that's part of the gift of the eight. But when it's tempered by that cruciform heart, the open heart in the moment, God, that's a powerful, mix for other people. And so I think, Rachel can continue to remind you of the power of the vulnerable heart, of the cruciform life. And I think also what you can, and of the many things that you can as an eight begin to share with her is, hey, guess what, Rachel? There are boundaries. that
To
that
every
no,
two who's had to figure
oh
out
yeah,
boundaries, it starts out with like a no before they find the like, no,
yes.
I'm
Well,
okay. Yeah.
that no is a full sentence, right? And so I think that also borrowing that strength, that capacity to not need, because what the two is so hungry for, and it sounds so basic, is you just want to be liked.
Yeah.
It sounds so simple, but we all want to be liked, but not like a two wants to be liked.
Yeah.
I mean, a two, your entire self-esteem, if I can use that word, uh, is born out of looking in the eyes of someone else who is saying to you, I don't know what I would do without you.
Yeah.
And that is a terrible medication. you,
Yeah.
you do not want to buy into that, because you're going to meet a lot of pathological people you're going to have to
Yeah.
cull from the herd somewhere along the line. uh, so I think there's so much the two of you can learn from each other. The key is, of course, like it's true for all of us, is your commitment to doing your own work will bring blessing to any relationship. The moment you abandon that, that's the moment that your relationship will falter.
Glory. Glory. This is a little swerve, but I just have to say it. Um, you have the privilege of having worked with one of the most remarkable human beings I know on the earth, Kathy Helmers.
Oh, is she your agent too?
No, she was, and then she wisely dumped me. But But
oh, she'll do that. Oh, no, I'm going to bring that into my awareness.
no,
That she does that.
I'm just saying she had a wisdom enough to know who she could work with. But two or three of the books that I have produced, she was very central to. So before we end, I just to be able to say, we are all, no matter how gifted we are or called we are, we're the byproduct in so many ways of the people who have invested rich gifts within us. And I know that Kathy has been one of those persons that you thank in your book. So just to underscore, the friendships you've developed reflect again the hospitality and the wisdom and the honor that you have offered to others, and even this interaction between Rachel and me. It's a sweet gift. So again, my friend, thank you. Thank you for joining us. And I trust that the story of you will be a good beginning for folks who do not know much about the Enneagram. I'm sorry, the road back to you being that, but this book in particular holds, for at least for us, and I hope for others, such a beautiful intersection of the gift of the Enneagram, but the honor of being able to engage one's story well.
Thanks, Dan and Rachel. I could have this conversation for hours. So I would love to come out to Seattle. I will pay my way, and I will pay you for the opportunity to come and talk about the Enneagram and story. Wouldn't that be great fun to do that together?
That would be so much fun.
I will consider that a formal offer, which even though I have some influence but little power, I will say we will take, and
I will love it.
We'll figure in a post non-post COVID crazy world that somehow the intersection of these conversations may be a gift, not just for us, but for the believing community.
It'd be fun. I would love that.
The Allender Center podcast is produced by the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology.
If you'd like more information about the Allender Center, you can look at theallendercenter.org.